Welcome to Beyond Disruption, where you'll learn how emerging tech is changing the world of accounting, business, and finance. Our guest experts break down the latest news in everything from blockchain to robotics, artificial intelligence to human intelligence. Tune in to find out how you can stay ahead of the curve.
Hello, I'm Kyle Hannan. I'm based out of the AICPA and CIMA office in the heart of London's financial district, and this is the Go Beyond Disruption podcast. In this episode, Silver Linings, the reward of the cloud, we'll be talking about cloud-based data and cybersecurity with expert guest Martin Capuder. Martin's a consultant, a project manager and a trainer with US-based ConsultantC, that is consultant with a C. It's a consultancy which focuses on secure cloud and databases, as well as IT audit, security controls, risk management and governance. And he'll help us answer questions like, why should we move our data from our premises to the cloud? Or isn't this all just hype? Or perhaps, okay, we see the benefits of moving with the time, so now what do we do? Let's get started with this week's conversation. Hello, Martin. Where are you joining us from?
I'm joining you from sunny Tampa, Florida.
Are you in one of those condominiums overlooking a beautiful stretch of coastline? You're inland. For someone who doesn't know, paint us a picture of what it looks like because it's morning for you at the moment, isn't it?
That is correct. Well, we are inland, so instead of seeing the shoreline, I see palm trees. When I look out the window, I often see pelicans and bald eagles, and sometimes there's a sandhill crane that walks down our street. It's really quite something to see. These birds are about 4 feet tall, and they're just walking down the street like a old couple.
We really appreciate the time you're taking to tear yourself away from that and stare at your computer screen for this interview. Let me start by giving people a sense of what you do. You're Managing Director of ConsultantC Services. You specialize in secure cloud and certification preparatory workshops, as well as solutions consulting, implementation, project management, and other custom training. Now, you've had over 25 years experience in IT audit, security, and controls consulting, as well as federal banking examinations. And this includes a decade of overseas projects and another as an expatriate employee for the world's largest company. Your professional designations include the CISA, the CIA, AWS CCP, CCSK, CFE, CAMS, CPA, and CSCP. And pretty obviously, you're a technical subject matter expert. And you are, in fact, one for the Association of International CPAs, the AICPA, our organization. You've spoken at conferences, you've spoken at professional meetings on 4 continents, and you've published over 36 professional journal articles. And you also serve as CEO of a very interesting organization called Global Trafficking ISAO. That's dedicated to combating human and wildlife trafficking, as well as finding time to be the editorial review team chair for the CSA's updated version 4 of Cloud Control Matrix. So it's pretty obvious that we're speaking to someone who is ideally placed to give us the inside track on anything cloud related. You'll help us get some new understandings of cybersecurity. You'll talk us through what effective migration from local to cloud storage should look like. You'll talk us through some recommended best practices, and we'll also talk about internal controls and how we can identify and manage risks, because we have called this episode Silver Linings. We've got to understand that those come with the cloud, and cloud computing, as well as the rewards and the benefits of it, the silver linings, is what you'll help us focus on. So, Martin, I've said quite a lot about you and your work already. So what have I left out? What else are you working on, and how does it connect with our topic?
Well, I do a lot of training development for the ISC Squared, which is another professional organization that's dedicated to cybersecurity. And it's wonderful because all of the topics are dealing with disruptive technologies, and it really keeps me up on that. And I like to balance the training and the consulting so that I keep up with what's going on in the profession.
We know that here on our podcast, and in fact in many other places, there's a lot of discussion about the concept of someone who's a polymath integrator. It's the new kind of professional that is a specialist in so many areas, but your core expertise, and you've got so many of them, they spread across several areas, as we've already heard. So which one of those is most important to you at the moment, and how did you develop your skills in that direction, and why?
Well, I've been involved with training development and delivery for about 25 years now. I have had trained the trainer several times, and all the training I've done is custom development. At this stage of my career, it's a wonderful area to be because of the fact that I have a broad experience over a long career, and I have much of that to share. And of course, being in this profession, you do need to keep up with all the latest technologies. And so that's what I'm doing. As far as the global trafficking ICAO, we're working on developing a security operations center that'll help identify and investigate incidents of human and wildlife trafficking. So this new venture for me is going to be a chance to use many of my cybersecurity skills.
And I think the fact that you're taking something that is so highly technical and turning it back into something that helps people and our natural world for real is quite extraordinary. It's quite disruptive too. But disruption is something that never stops, does it? Things have always been changing. So in the context of the work you've done in the past, what was the last big disruption that you saw in the profession, and how did it change the organizations you were working with?
Well, I think the most recent disruptive technology has been the cloud, and it's enabled organizations to be more agile with the opportunity to implement new applications and capabilities faster, and also the capability to use advanced technologies like big data, artificial intelligence, and advanced analytics and such, while increasing their cybersecurity capabilities, the whole aspect of what we're talking about here today.
Those disruptions started to change the organizations that you were working with. Did you find that many of them understood what it would take?
Well, being a disruptive technology is a different paradigm of computing. And the wisest thing when you're thinking about implementing this is to make sure that before you actually make that decision, that there is a baseline of knowledge, that there is at least a basic understanding of the cloud and what it can deliver at all levels of the organization, including going all the way up to the C-suite and the board of directors, because they're the ones who are going to be making the major decisions regarding cloud implementations.
Right, so it's got to go all the way to the top. And let's bring it all the way back to the present if we look at our topic today, which is cloud computing and cybersecurity. We've called this episode Silver Linings. What does this say about why this topic is so important right now?
Cloud solutions can be a silver lining to many organizations in terms of the types of rewards and capabilities that they've been seeking. I recently gave a presentation to the Florida Audit Forum on the fact that staying in legacy technologies has a very high cost. And one of these high costs is in terms of cybersecurity. Many organizations are afraid to bite the bullet because of the time, effort, and some money that will be necessary for the conversion. But it really is a cost benefit, and a lot of organizations don't understand all of the high costs of staying where they are. It's important to realize that that cloud solutions are not for every entity. Many entities have implemented a strategy called Cloud First, which says when they're considering a new implementation, consider cloud solutions first. And the organizations who have chosen that strategy find it to be a worthwhile strategy, and they have a tendency to stick with that.
You mentioned two things which I think I'd love to find out more about, because many of our listeners will be people to whom this type of vocabulary makes perfect sense. But for those who may not have spent much time in this world, let's talk about some of the phrases, some of the jargon, some of the basics. You talked about something, I think the word was entities. You also mentioned legacy tech. What are some of the key terms and vocab that anyone would need to know about here when they're talking about cloud data and cloud storage? And do you think these terms apply to individuals or to teams or to entire organizations? Let's start off with I mentioned the word organization. Am I right in saying that when you say entities, you mean businesses, you mean organizations, not something that I might remember from a Stephen King film?
Organizations that we call the provider of cloud solutions to be the cloud service provider. And on the other end, you would have your entity client. Of course, as a person, you subscribe to many cloud services as well. But this presentation will be focusing primarily on the organizational implementations of the cloud.
Perfect. What about legacy tech? What are some examples of that?
Legacy tech would include mainframe applications, ERP systems that are not in the cloud. The big focus on legacy, which is an aspect that makes implementation of the cloud more difficult, are what I would call the in-house developed applications that have very poor documentation. These are the ones that make all this stuff I say about how wonderful it is to go to the cloud. Well, it's still appropriate to move these legacy, difficult to implement solutions to the cloud. It's just that they will take longer, and they're not the low-hanging fruit. You should focus on applications that are more easy to implement, and therefore have these as more of a long-term project.
Okay, so when we talk about cloud data, cloud storage, is there any vocabulary that we need to know about there? For example, is there just one sort of cloud storage, or are there many?
Well, this is a short podcast. There is a extensive vocabulary in this, but if I have to choose one aspect that is probably most important to understand, is the cloud platform and the extent to which the platform is under control of the cloud service provider or of the client. And the one extreme is called infrastructure as a service, abbreviated as IaaS. And this is where you have the maximum infrastructure in the cloud with the cloud service provider. And we think about the AWS, the Amazon Web Services, the Google Cloud, and Microsoft Azure as examples. Having said that, that is the primary platform that they offer, but they also do offer the services in the other categories. The other end of the spectrum that many people are familiar with and use on a daily basis is called software as a service, SaaS, or sometimes just called Saas. And this is where the entity has most of the infrastructure And the cloud service provider is just providing the application with some security controls like identity access management. And you would be familiar with many of the examples of this. Salesforce, Office productivity, which includes things like Microsoft Office and G Suite. Very familiar with social media, Facebook and LinkedIn, but also for organizations, you'd be looking at WebEx. You're talking about data. You'd be talking about cloud storage like SharePoint and Dropbox, which has a business application as well. DocuSign, Zendesk, Adobe Creative Cloud. Now, within the software as a service, you'll hear a lot of things described as a service, such as security as a service, disaster recovery as a service, database as a service, healthcare as a service, robotic process automation, RPA as a service. So all of these are really just variations of software as a service. In between, there is the platform as a service, PaaS, and this is used primarily for organizations to do their applications development. And finally, there is what we would call a private cloud, which is a cloud that is just set up for the organization itself. I can illustrate that by looking at AWS and Amazon. Now, AWS is the largest infrastructure as a service provider, has a large number of customers. But as far as Amazon, which is part of that company, they operate as a private cloud. They do not participate in the resource sharing that goes on with the AWS that the other clients use.
So we've got IaaS, which is infrastructure as a service. We've got SaaS, software as a service. You've got PaaS, which is platform as a service. And you've also got this private cloud. You've explained that so many of us are already familiar with services like G Suite, G Drive, Microsoft's OneDrive. You've got SharePoint. We in Dropbox and many other services in a similar way, we're, as individuals, perhaps as very small business units, users, we're already familiar with putting our data in the cloud. But when it comes to doing it for an entire enterprise, then you need to be moving on to a whole different level. So I'm getting a sense that, cloud storage and data moving from a local premise application to being stored somewhere up there, this can apply to almost everyone. So how would someone know whether this is something that would impact the way that their organization is working right now? Give us a sense of what this means in practice.
First of all, let me comment on something that you just said. You're talking about the personal use versus the organizational use. And so many of the applications have both. Dropbox has a simple personal use one. They have one for businesses and they have one for enterprises. SharePoint is the corporate equivalent of OneDrive. So as you move up the scale of the size of the organization, these applications provide more advanced capabilities. So it's rather a continuum between the personal and at the other end of the spectrum, the enterprise. So one of the key aspects is about implementing the cloud is wondering, where are the client organization located? In many different locations, this provides for giving them the services wherever they might be and allowing very open sharing of information and giving you the benefits of having a complete database for the entity that is updated from many different locations.
So in practice, one would have to know where all one's data is before one starts to think about migrating it. And that means documenting, being aware, making sure that that knowledge exists on many different levels in the organization, right through from entry-level IT right the way up to the C-suite. And then it has to move. And we'll be talking about what that might involve as we continue our conversation with Martin Capuder shortly. We're talking about cloud data, cybersecurity. All of that is coming up in this episode of the Go Beyond Disruption podcast. It's brought to you by the Association of International Certified Professional Accountants. You can find out more about this podcast and about the rest of our wider project at gobeyonddisruption.com. If you're a first-time listener, remember you can share this easily. Tell someone about the podcast if you think it would be of interest or use to them. And of course, you can subscribe to this on any platform out there. We're not talking about cloud platforms, we're talking about podcast ones. So it could be on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts. You can even tell your smart speaker to play us. Talking about smart speakers, we're talking to a very smart speaker. He's a presenter. He's a person who has written widely and provided a lot of assurance to many organizations about cloud computing and internal control. So much more to hear from our guest, Martin Capuder. Martin, what are the typical challenges that an organization would face when moving to the cloud? Are there a top 3 typical challenges?
First of all, it's important to recognize that implementing a cloud solution is a new paradigm, and there is a shifting of expectations. A lot of organizations have gotten away from a basic IT discipline of specifications development, of defining their requirements that they're looking for. And when you're considering a cloud solution, you must begin with at least the basic knowledge of the cloud capabilities before you develop these specifications. There will be a skills transfer. Your IT personnel will need to have a different set of skills and knowledge, which will require a certain amount of retraining and redeployment. And one of the things that I see is that organizations don't put enough emphasis on the required training and the new paradigms. I've heard concerns, well, I have some IT personnel who are near retirement, and how do I get them to adopt a whole new set of skills? And I explain, well, it's in their best interest to have this. If they want to do any IT work when they retire, all the skills that they have right now are legacy, and it's better for them to have the new set of skills and knowledge. A lot of organizations are concerned because the cloud solutions can result in more efficient operations, which means sometimes with less personnel. And so you have to decide, if I need less IT people, then what is my plan for what they're going to do in the organization? Am I just going to let them go? Are they going to transition to be a consultant to the organization? That is a major issue. And it's important to make sure that once you've made the decision, that you have the proper expertise to implement it, meaning that you're going to need to hire people with the proper cloud knowledge and expertise, having that in a mix of finding effective cloud solutions implementer consultants. And the last challenge that I see is that there's many missed opportunities for process reengineering, that organizations are trying to implement a cloud solution that looks just like their legacy system, and they're losing many of the benefits, recognizing that reengineering your processes might take that transition to the cloud and make it a little bit longer, but that is a definite investment and is a wise thing to do in the long run.
So what I'm hearing you say is you need to make the decision, you need to mix your experts, be they in-house or consultants, appropriately, and then you have to make the move. You're not simply reinventing what you already had. You need to be changing it. And that comes with risks, that comes with a certain amount of worry, I would imagine. But, of course, there are benefits. There's a reason people do that. That's the silver linings we're talking about. So let's swing back there. What would organizations generally be focusing on at the stage that they'd be talking about migrating? Would you expect to see more conversations about the risks or the rewards, the kind of the downside or the upside? I mean, how would an organization prioritize these to really see that the cloud does indeed have that silver lining to focus on?
Well, the good news is that the cloud does reduce many risks, particularly in terms of cybersecurity and availability. I want to emphasize that it's not a panacea. Some CEOs will say, well, it's in the cloud, so it's all secure. Well, the important thing is that there are new risks of going to the cloud, and recognizing that every cloud deployment or architectural decision that's made has a security implementation. You can look at cloud solutions as a smorgasbord. They have default features and advanced features. And so for each feature that you implement, you have to understand the risk and the benefit of each of these decisions. Of course, the benefits we're going to be going into shortly. But the important thing to realize is that what is going to guide you through this process is your risk management process. Now, a lot of people hear risk and they think only of negative risks. Risk management actually involves the negative risks plus the positive risk, which of course we would call benefits. And they have to be aligned with the risk appetite of the organization. What sort of risks are they willing to assume, and which ones do they want to avoid? And I would also like to point out here that the risk management process may change because the cloud solution is a new paradigm, that there may need to be some sort of adjustment to the risk appetite.
One of the big adjustments is seeing that data move from on-premise locations to somewhere up there. And I suppose that makes many people skeptical about cloud cybersecurity. On the one hand, they say, well, we've got everything locked down. I can see it. It's everything sitting in our server room. We know that it's up there on the fourth floor. We lock it up at night. It's got night watchmen at reception. We know where it all is. So we're a bit skeptical when everything moves up to the cloud. You know, we've just heard about hacks on a weekly basis. So they don't know that there's much benefit to this. What would you say to them if they're a bit skeptical about the security that going to the cloud can offer?
Well, first of all, I would venture to say that the organizations that you're describing using the legacy technology do not realize how much the legacy technology has inherent vulnerabilities for cybersecurity and some of the advantages that the cloud can offer. There is a tremendous shortage of IT expertise and even a greater shortage of the cybersecurity IT specialists. And what that does is it, of course, when you have a short supply, it increases their salaries. And many organizations have trouble hiring and attracting and retaining the IT cybersecurity specialists. And so that creates a challenge when you're in the on-premise solutions. When you move to the cloud organizations have the benefits of economies of scale, and have the opportunity to hire the best and the brightest talent and implement the latest cybersecurity capabilities. One of the problems that you have with an on-premise solution is you make a big investment in a new computer, and that computer is going to be there for 3 to 5 years. Some organizations stretch that to be 10 to 15 years. There are many organizations, unfortunately, that are running on 30-plus year-old technology. So the idea here is that in the cloud, they're making these changes, these incremental changes on a regular basis, and prevents this cycle of having to make heavy investments and stick with them for a long period of time. There are many advantages to the cybersecurity. We don't have enough time to go into all of them or go into them in great depth, but the concept of defense in depth is a basic cornerstone of cybersecurity, and by default, the implementations of cloud security offer all these different layers of defense that a hacker would have to go through. The cloud gives you the opportunity to test security in the development stage, which is not really possible with the legacy technology. We call this secure deployment enablers. You can implement technologies like immutable objects. Once you have the configuration, the current configuration deployed, then people cannot go into the configuration of any particular device and change it. It's only centrally that new configurations can be deployed. And I think of encryption. My favorite story about encryption is I went to an organization and I said, your policies require encryption if the process owner requests it. They said, well, no process owner has ever requested it. I said, maybe that's because it's not available. And this database administrator was probably my most upset audit client, because he told me, he said, you're telling me to implement encryption means I have to empty my plate of all the other projects that I have for the rest of the year and to implement encryption technology. Well, the cloud solutions give you built-in solutions that are by default available, and the more advanced ones, it's a service on demand. So you choose that feature and boom, you've got it. And this helps enable that you can have encryption at rest and in transmission.
And what you've said makes perfect sense in a practical way. I think if we tied it down into just one sentence, when you've got an on-premise solution and you think about your security for your data is provided by the best in the building, whereas if it's gone to the cloud, it's provided by the best in the business. And I think that makes it very, very clear. But it does sound a little bit to some people like a marketing ploy. And I'm going to play a bit of devil's advocate on you here. There are those who will then say, well, we hear about these benefits and all these amazing things you could be doing, tick-a-box solutions, save a half year's worth of effort from my own team just by signing up for this or that service which is being sold to me. Show you all of this cybersecurity stuff, this cloud is just a marketing ploy. Would you say it's a bit more than that? Do you think they're just not getting the full picture or just getting the wrong literature?
Well, many can see it as a marketing ploy. You make a representation and you say, I will provide you 99.999. You take 9 nines and put it behind the 99%, and it creates what's called 11 nines. I have this type of durability to my equipment. Well, how do you know that that is the case in reality? Well, there is a method of trust, and for those in the audience who are CPAs, they may be familiar with the term SOC report, a security and organization control report. And this is performed by a CPA firm, putting their reputation on the line, and says, I have taken the representations that management makes about the security and control, and I have looked at the design, and I have tested the effectiveness of these controls. So this is very key to gaining the understanding of how good the security and controls are. For an organization that is considering various cloud solution providers, a SOC 3 report will be provided, which provides a certain level of detail without going so deep as to, help an entity figure out how to defeat the effectiveness of the controls. But once you are a client, you are entitled to what's called a SOC 2 report. Now, there are various levels of the SOC 2 report, and it's important for you to understand what the different levels are, what you're getting and what you need to get. But these are very important because your security requirements may change over time. The cloud service provider may be changing their capabilities, and you have to make sure that this is going on in parallel, making sure that a cloud service provider is still meeting your needs. And I would emphasize that it's important to have many disciplines read this report, because the different expertise, it's not, I've gotten this report and I look at the bottom line and it says the controls are fine, is, a clean opinion on the adequacy of controls. It really needs to be gone through in depth and look at each control that is important to the organization. If they're not satisfied with the response, then they communicate with the cloud service provider and say, we're not really happy with this control. As far as other areas of compliance, often there's either an audit or I'll call it an assessment. The difference between an audit and an assessment is an audit is performed by a CPA firm and an assessment is performed by an independent assessing organization without the assurance level of a CPA firm. And these reports of regulatory compliance, for instance, can be very important. United States, we refer to HIPAA in terms of the requirements for healthcare systems. There may be equivalents in other countries. Of course, GDPR has introduced a lot of requirements. You want to know whether your systems are GDPR compliant. There's even the assessment reports on the Department of Defense, or for the government systems, there is a program called FedRAMP, which says that if you're going to supply services to the federal government, that you have to be FedRAMP assessed.
So with regard to the marketing ploy question, as long as there's enough reassuring, evidence-driven, factual information behind the sales or the marketing, then it's not hype. It's just an introduction to find out more reasons why it's a good thing. So as long as there's evidence and as long as there's process and reassurance and controls behind it, there's really plenty there to reassure people this is the right thing to do. But then once they've made that decision, it's all about trust. And you did talk about someone else looking at the processes, someone else signing something off and saying, yes, I'm satisfied that they've done everything that they should have done. But whose responsibility is this? Because if you're talking about trust, if you're talking about who takes the lead on implementing security, whose responsibility is that to deliver that cloud cybersecurity solution?
Well, if there is a scandal of a breach, when the public hears about it, there are times when the client entity says, well, that wasn't a breach of my system. That was a breach in the cloud service provider. Well, I'm sorry. That answer is unacceptable to the public. We have to remember that when an organization has their audit report, there is a management letter on there. So this is a parallel concept here. The management letter says, I is management. The CEO and CFO and all the senior management of the organization is ultimately responsible for the system of internal controls. Therefore, if there is a breach on the other end, it is, as far as at this cloud service provider, it's still management's responsibility because they chose that cloud service provider and they need to do their diligence to make sure that cloud service provider is always providing the proper level of cybersecurity.
All right. So when someone turns around and says, well, there are many different cloud solutions out there, moving to one or the other may offer similar features, but perhaps the costs differ. What do these typical solutions generally cost? How would they impact when it comes to the financial planning? And are people aware of what it may physically take in terms of investment before they start to see some of the cost benefits? Well, the whole phrase cost benefit, the phrase starts with the word cost. So what do they have to bear in mind in that context?
I was mentioned before about different paradigms of going to the cloud. And when you look at this traditional legacy systems, I had described this to you where you make a large capital expenditure and then you live with that for a period of time, 3 to 5 years, 3 to 10 years, whatever. The difference in the cloud is very different in that it becomes, in most every incident, a operating expense where it's a variable expense. You're not making these big investments. So the conversion costs are one issue. And if you're comparing the difference of moving a legacy ERP system to a more modern on-premise ERP, that would have a certain conversion cost. And there'd be a different conversion cost if you're going to the cloud. So you can compare the conversion costs, but once you get past the conversion and you're in that operating stage, it becomes a much different model of the operating costs. And because of the economies of scale that cloud service providers have, then these operating costs, as in terms of variable operating expenses, become much lower, and they provide capabilities that you would never have. There is this term of auto scaling, and the idea is if you need more capacity in terms of memory or in terms of storage, you have the capability to instantly change to that level and then go back down to the level that's now appropriate. And this whole model is called pay as you go, which helps resolve the whole capacity planning model. You don't have to rely on providing for excess capacity, which is wasteful. Now you're able to provide flexible capacity.
And when organizations have made this move onto the cloud, it's time for silver linings. Surely then this begins almost like throwing a stone into a pond. It's going to have a ripple effect. What other disruptive technologies may these cloud solutions start to enable across a business or an enterprise?
I would like to point out one aspect, high availability. The cloud offers high availability features that would just be cost prohibitive on an on-premise solution. For instance, each cloud service provider is set up in terms of regions, and within that region, they'll have sub-regions, sometimes called availability zones or whatever the particular cloud service provider calls it. But each of these different sub-regions, computing systems, are all in a location where one disaster would not wipe out two of the sub-regions. They're all connected to different electrical grids, for instance, and you can be splitting your load through load balancing to these different subregions. And if one of them goes down, your load balancer will detect that and stop communicating with that particular region and set up an instance in another region. This is something that you can't do. I bring up the idea of online real-time disaster recovery testing, not possible with conventional technology. But Netflix will, they have a very interesting program, which is now open source, called the Chaos Monkey, and it enables them to test the availability by seeing that when they take down a node on purpose, that another node will pop up. But to get to your main question, the kind of advanced capabilities that become so much more available when you go to the cloud in terms of built-in solutions, pre-built solutions. We're talking about things like the Internet of Things, or taking it to a very commercial level, the industrial Internet of Things, big data, the robotic process automation, high-performance computing, which we used to know as supercomputers, the very fast, amazing capabilities, machine learning, artificial intelligence, blockchain. The very largest of the cloud service providers give you global reach. And that gives you the capability of putting your data or your media very close to your users, which gives you higher performance in terms of response time. Very important to clients. And you could say it's very important to employees as well, to make sure that their time is more productive, not waiting for the computer to respond. So you're putting the computer closer to the clients. I could go on and on. It's absolutely amazing. Many of the benefits that need to be considered that most organizations are probably not considering.
Well, I think I might take you up on that offer. Let's go on in one particular direction. If you think about our typical listener, now we know here on the podcast, our audience like to keep ahead of the curve. So help us out here. Take us one step further from your perspective and experience. What's the next disruption you see coming?
Well, as I was mentioning, the cloud has enabled many advanced disruptive technologies, and you have to look not just at the particular technology, but the integration of all these disruptive capabilities. For instance, artificial intelligence requires big data and often supercomputing because of the high processing requirements. And this just, the curve keeps getting pushed. And what we find is that each of these technologies is advancing, and the benefit of integrating all these technologies is advancing. So I'd say that the cumulative effect of the advancement of all these technologies is really creating the next disruption.
A case of many hands making light work. We just don't know what that light will illuminate, but we're all eager to see, definitely. Before we wrap up, let's do some signposting. For anyone who'd like to find out more about this topic in general, or about your work, Martin, in particular, what are some resources you'd recommend?
You mentioned that I'm involved with the CSA, and I'm sorry, many people may not be familiar with the CSA. The CSA is the Cloud Security Alliance, and they're at cloudsecurityalliance.org. They have a very important document called the CSA Security Guidance, which gives a good overview of the different, you mentioned the terminology, goes over all the important terminology, all the important processes, the benefits and the risks of the cloud computing. When you prove that you master the information in the CSA Security Guidance, you can earn the CCSK, the Certificate in Cloud Security Knowledge. So this might help provide a baseline knowledge for the IT technical people before you implement it. When you're considering various cloud service alternatives, you might want to go to the section of the site that mentions the Csa Star Reports. And the Star Reports are either a self-assessment, independent assessment, or an audit of the various controls. And you will find this enlightening to how each organization, how they put attention to the security and controls. I mentioned the CCSK. There are many different professional certifications. Some of them are generic for vendor neutral, and the others are specific to the vendors. That can be helpful. And my organization is, if you want to find out more about my organization and myself, my website is ConsultantC.services.
So to wrap this up, what's one actionable suggestion that you'd like to leave for accounting and finance professionals that will help them go beyond disruption?
Well, I'd say that for accounting and finance professionals, the outstanding opportunity and benefit for them is the opportunity for process automation through robotic process automation, or the combination of robotic process and automation with the artificial intelligence called intelligent process automation. And this helps the CPA firm, their clients, or the CPA and industry to achieve both efficiency and effectiveness, which enables them to free their employees from doing mundane tasks and allows them to move towards having much more value-added tasks. So this is, as far as I'm concerned, the biggest low-hanging fruit for CPA firms and the accounting and finance profession in general.
So drop the mundane and grab that low-hanging fruit. Thank you, Martin.
My pleasure.
I think that is a great place to end our conversation today. There's plenty more to explore on this topic of cloud, data, and cybersecurity. So our show notes will have links to all of the resources that we have mentioned. For those, just click on the episode's info icon in your podcast app, and you can do that on your smartphone or tablet. You can also open the episode in your computer's web browser. And you can just use Google Chrome, whatever browser you use. You'll find everything right there. And that will include links to our brand new cybersecurity certificate, Beyond the Fundamentals, as well as to our digital CPA conference coming up this December in Seattle, Washington, which combines cloud and mobile technology with practice development strategies for new cloud accounting services. There are two other websites we'd recommend for listeners interested in taking this further. You can go to AICPAstore.com/GoBeyondDisruption or the CGMAstore.com/GoBeyondDisruption. You'll find courses, webinars, and other professional development resources to keep you ahead of the curve. Thanks again to our guest, Martin Capuder of Florida-based ConsultantC. And of course, thank you for listening to this podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, go tell someone about it. You can even tell us what you think using the feedback link in our show notes. We'd love to know what you think and what you'd like to hear more of. Find us everywhere online, or try telling your smart speaker to play the latest episode of the Go Beyond Disruption podcast. That generally works. From our office in the heart of the City of London, I'm Kyle Hannan. We'll be back soon with more conversations that help you and your profession to go beyond disruption. Till next time, goodbye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Beyond Disruption, brought to you by the Association of International Certified Professional Accountants. Learn more about today's topic at AICPA-CIMA.com/disruption. This podcast is designed to provide illustrative information with respect to the subject matter covered and does not represent an official opinion or position of the Association of International Certified Professional Accountants or any of its subsidiaries or affiliates. It is provided with the understanding that the association, its affiliates, and subsidiaries are not engaged in rendering legal, accounting, or other professional services. If such advice or expert assistance is required, the services of a competent professional person should be sought. The association, its subsidiaries, and affiliates make no representations, warranties, or guarantees as to and assume no responsibility for the content or application of the material contained herein, and expressly disclaim all liability for such damages arising out of the use of, reference to, or reliance on such material.